Hi, welcome to our panel discussions today. We're really glad to have you. We've got our first panel discussing standardized payment interfaces as digital public infrastructure, learning from India and Brazil. And our moderator of the day is Nicolo Zingales, a professor in information law and regulation at the Law School of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio de Janeiro, fascinated by the interaction of law, technology, and markets. I'll hand over for you to introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, welcome everybody. So it's a pleasure to introduce you here to this panel where we're going to discuss one of the hottest issues in terms of public governance. You might have followed the discussions of the G20 that have taken place in India this year, and there's also an anticipation of this issue that we're going to discuss here being at the center stage in the next G20 that is going to be hosted by Brazil next year. And this issue is digital public infrastructure. So what this concept refers to is basically what we expect the government to provide as infrastructure that encourages the development of the local ecosystem in a digital environment. And so it's something that we have seen being developed, particularly in these two countries that we have represented here in this panel, which are India and Brazil. And it has a few components, just to give a quick introduction to the concept. So there is a component that is about an interoperability layer, so the fact that people can connect in a standardized way to this infrastructure. It has also a few different parts, so a few different functions that can be combined together. So it has this modularity aspect to it. And it also is supposed to develop some public interest function. So this is what we see as characteristics of the digital public infrastructure. And also importantly, something that will be discussed here, there needs to be some governance associated to it. So it's not just about the physical element of the infrastructure, but there's also some kind of legal and policy governance that goes around it. And examples that we have seen of implementation of this approach have been with regard to digital identity, digital payment, and an infrastructure for data sharing. So here we're going to discuss some of these issues. We have here in order Smriti Parshira, who is a CyberBRICS fellow, non-resident fellow at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio de Janeiro. Larissa Magalhães, who is also a CyberBRICS fellow at the same institution. And finally, Bruna Cataldo, who is from Instituto Propage, also in Rio de Janeiro. Prior to delving into really the core of the discussion, I think it's important also to understand where we are coming from, and so understand what were the challenges that government faced with regard to creating a more competitive market in the payment space. So our focus here will not be on all types of digital infrastructure, we will focus on the payment, and particularly on how standardized payment infrastructure are a public infrastructure, a digital public infrastructure that we need in this new environment. So prior to building in a proactive manner the digital public infrastructure, the state tried to kind of create interoperability and competitiveness by forcing the private entities, namely the banks, to be interoperable, to be non-discriminatory, and to not sign exclusive agreements. So basically to open up the private market. And so we would like to understand what was this experience, starting with Brazil and then with India. So I will ask first Bruna to tell us a little bit about these developments in Brazil.
Okay, well, yesterday I actually finished my talk telling you how Brazil's regulators changed their mindset throughout time to foster innovation, but that actually started with what Nicolo said. We had Huge competition problem in payments, especially we had a duopoly in acquiring. And to give you some data context, cards were in Brazil for 40 years, but they only had like 12 transactions per capita in 2009. That put Brazil in second to last in a list of about 15 countries. The top 5 had 80 transactions per capita. And we had this technology for 40 years. In 2010, the Competition Authority and the Central Bank, they were like trying to improve private infrastructures, and they broke this duopoly. They opened the market. They created a regulatory framework for payments. We didn't have that. They created new profiles of institutions, new types of licenses with less regulatory requirements. And 10 years later, Brazil actually has 140 per capita transactions in cards. So it was, and went from having 22 payment startups in 2009 to having 122 in 2021. So it was a huge success. Payments became acquiring especially became a very competitive market in Brazil. And we had a boom of fintechs, and a boom of innovation, and a boom of competition. So from this moment, the central bank actually realized, like, oh, innovation is a very good way to foster competition. So this is how they started to evolve their mentality to foster these ideas. And they were like, but maybe we can make this even bigger if instead of trying to just act as someone supervising private infrastructures and guaranteeing they are interoperable, if we can provide the infrastructure ourselves, and then the market develops from there. We give them the basis, and they evolve from there. So this, the case of payments and cards specifically in Brazil was the starting point. It's considered a huge success, and it's where the regulators' mindset actually changed. And it's where the idea of DPI started blossoming. It wasn't that at that point, but the idea started from there. So it was like, and it was very fast because this was in 2010. So.
Yes, thank you. And I think particularly because it's difficult to check whether the players are really providing full interoperability. So it's much better to have full control over the infrastructure and make sure that it's interoperable. And so I wonder if in India it was like a similar dynamic that then led to the creation of DPI.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicolo. Hi, everyone. So I'll start with a little bit of context. The interoperability conversation is relatively new in India, but in terms of just, tracing back into the structural context of the Indian market, it's important to recognize that the financial sector is heavily bank-dominated, like in many jurisdictions, and specifically this particular class of institutions called public sector banks. These are banks which are owned by the state. So until the liberalization of the Indian economy, the entire banking sector was only owned by the state. In the early 90s, that began to get opened up, and there were private players, foreign players who came up. But really, the level of competition wasn't such that people were not competing for that rural customer in the last mile. Everybody was, looking for the lower hanging fruit, the customers in the urban localities, really. So in terms of ATM penetration, in terms of bank branches penetration, there was really nothing happening in terms of the rural customer being served, or in terms of the suitability of products being designed. And the thing to remember here is, before we come to payments, the prerequisite for that is often, having a bank account. And that bank penetration was so poor as early as, as recently as 2011, there is the Global Findex database, which says that only 35% of the population in India, those who were surveyed, had bank accounts. In terms of card penetration, we had just Visa and MasterCard, which were the main operators, and their penetration was so low, only 9% of the people had credit cards and debit cards. So really, it's in this context that there wasn't very effective competition taking place either among banks in terms of improving penetration and improving access, although there were some initiatives trying to have models like banking correspondence, where you have agents going to the customer even though there may not be physical infrastructure like ATMs at the last mile. But really, until the more recent thing, which we'll talk about now, I guess, we hadn't really seen deeper adoption and penetration happening.
Very interesting. And also, I think this highlights an interesting point that there was a problem also of competition, even if it was a public bank situation. So basically, it's not that when there is the government providing a service, necessarily everything works, right? So digital public infrastructure refers to something that can be used for the public, but not necessarily that is controlled by the state exclusively. So I think this is an excellent preface to then move into the digital environment. So what changed this whole revolution of the agendas in the central bank in Brazil and in India, particularly starting from Brazil, we had the so-called BC hashtag agenda that had this vision of revolutionizing the regulation of payments through at least 3 different innovations. So here, I guess we can hear from Larissa, also Brazilian, how she sees the development in that regard.
Thank you, Nicolo. So, okay, related to the central bank agenda. The agenda represents a shift of internal and external resource and capabilities. Related internal resource, the central bank has been promoted some acts and efforts to implement education, customer protection, and financial inclusion. And also related to external resource, the central bank has been working with several actors that you can call ecosystem to promote technology innovation, which involve payment through the mobile device, the new payment initiator, innovation laboratory, sandbox, etc. So these capabilities, internal and external, facilitate the open finance systems in Brazil because the central bank was able to promote a governance framework, which is decentralized, functions across those actors at the ecosystem that I told you, but also support the ecosystem by the update regulatory. So they deliver some new orders and decrees to organize all the ecosystem. So the open finance in Brazil in practice that you can consider that I call capabilities. It's a capabilities to share and exchange data across the broad ecosystem because there is a phase, kind of a cycle that first of all you are consent your data and after you can exchange some data related to the service that you already choose, okay? And you also have user capabilities to promote several APIs application that can also provocate or facilitate the competitiveness between the actors at the ecosystem. And you also have the ecosystem capabilities to promote, I see right now, to promote the application, So this set of resource has been consolidated the open finance system in Brazil, but also includes digital public infrastructure because they provide the interoperability to connect the peaks. But I will let this part to say in the next question that you probably have. But I do like to address my final comment that we need to pay attention that digital public infrastructure is a key to achieve the sustainable development goals. So promote digital inclusion is part of it. So that's why it's important we share these capabilities. Thank you.
You mentioned, so now this data sharing infrastructure that was provided. Maybe you can comment just to clarify how the standardization of these interfaces works here, because we have seen this framework, for example, in the United Kingdom, where the regulator really managed to set the standard for all banks. But it's not exactly the same in Brazil. So how is the governance of that? Maybe, I don't know if you or Bruna want to comment on it. Yeah.
Yes, it's good. I can comment it. What happened with open finance governance, it's first of all, the central bank, it's a main responsible related regulatory. So if you have some conflict interest between the actors in the ecosystem, or problem with institutions, the central bank will be there to solve it. And you have clear rules also. But the bank also gives some power for the actors at the ecosystems organized for beyond the ecosystem. So we have, for example, one office by secretariat that can organize the daily routine, but also have a lot of working groups, the discussion, the standards, the techniques, to unify all the system, and looking for the APIs that you have. And finally, you have like a divisor board that is very representative for people from the government, not very representative, let me say, because I will make some criticism about it finally. But we have some representative from the private and the public sector. So what I say is, although the governance framework it's new, the work that the central bank has been developing, it's since 20 years ago, that has been promoted the agenda for digital, not necessarily digital, but financial inclusive. And each comes match in maybe 5 years ago in the new agenda that the moment that the government decide to bring digital innovation for make it a platform or support for digital inclusion in Brazil.
Okay,
Financial digital inclusion.
Yes, thank you. So it's sort of a framework of assisted self-regulation or steered self-regulation, you would say. It's not only self-regulation, like the government is kind of leading, but it's not imposing necessarily. So maybe Bruna can clarify. You already mentioned something yesterday along those lines.
Yeah, it's this idea that with open finance, you should provide the ecosystem so the private market could build upon it. And this reflects on the governance. So I believe Larissa will talk about the problems. But what Brazil has been actually, people were saying, oh, this is good. Even the UK said this is good. It's this idea that the government centralizes the governance, but it includes and promotes the participation of everyone in the ecosystem. And also, I think it's important to say, from a competition standpoint, which is I comment more, they made it mandatory for the 5 banks that concentrated the market. So incumbents had to participate with this idea that if my goal is to promote competition and bring new entrants and bring fintech and bring innovation, all of these 5 banks should participate, and those who want to enter the market should be voluntarily applying. They were not mandatory, but it was good for them. And all of them participate in the governance. So it's not, even though it's publicly provided, it's not publicly controlled.
Yeah, very interesting. So how is that paralleled in India? Is there some similar dynamic? How is the governance and infrastructure on open banking or open finance?
Sure. Yeah, so, if some of you were here in the conversation yesterday, there was some discussion about UPI, the Unified Payment Interface, which is, India's model of facilitating instant payments. And I'd just like to take a moment to locate that in, where that particular example is coming off. It's a part of this bigger move towards digital public infrastructure, which is labeled under something called India Stack. So the idea of it is to create, it's usually depicted in the form of different layers, where one layer builds on top of the other. So the base layer is digital identity. On top of that, you have, online signing mechanisms. On top of that, you have the digital payment mechanisms. And finally, you have data exchange and consent managed kind of mechanisms. And the ones of interest, I guess, to this conversation are mostly around UPI, digital payments, as well as around data exchanges, which is, again, a new developing space. On UPI, it's a little different from the Brazilian model. The way it's worked out is, it is through a private-public partnership, but UPI is located inside an entity. It's owned and managed by an entity called the National Payments Corporation of India. It's a not-for-profit entity which was set up by the banking industry. So it's owned by banks, and more recently the shareholding has been diversified. So other non-bank payment operators have also been given a small role to play in the management of the company. But the idea is this body is responsible for setting the standards, which then all the other participants in the ecosystem are supposed to follow. And the ecosystem really broadly consists of banks, of course, but also this new class of entities called third-party payment apps. So, players like Google, WhatsApp, Amazon, all of them are participants in this market in India. They've all created their third-party apps. In fact, about 90% of the market today is being, the transactions are taking place through PhonePe, which is a subsidiary of Walmart, Google Pay, as well. So that the big tech dominance, which in some way, these architectures are supposed to address, are not going away. And I guess we can talk a little bit more about those criticisms towards the end. But the design of it is that every individual who wants to transact on this platform will have a virtual payment address, and they will then transact using that address, through one of these third-party apps, or even banks may provide competing apps. And through this network, the real-time transaction takes place. And the interesting part of this is, of course, that given that this is owned by the banking industry, there are questions about this remains a banking-centric model, and therefore you can't do away with, although there are third-party payments app which will become the front-end facing part, the consumer interaction on the front end, the back end will always be a banking-dependent model. And so there are these questions around, that you've locked in this particular structure and in some way created a natural monopoly with this one umbrella entity which is backed and supported by the state, owned by the private sector, not necessarily, very rigorously being regulated, not very accountable to all the participants. And therefore, some questions do come up with that. But, the popular narrative, and it is true that it is a phenomenal success that has been witnessed through UPI. It's currently seeing something to the tune of, like 10 billion transactions in a month. So it's really supposed to be the largest payment system in the world currently in terms of the number of transactions at least. So it is phenomenally successful, but there are challenges as well that come with it.
I'm just curious, how do they select the industry players that go into the governance body? Is there some transparency over that?
So one part of it is that, as I told you about the public sector bank dominance, there is a law which requires that 51% of the shareholding of any such entity has to be held by public sector banks. So that part of it is a given. For the rest of it, you have the private banks, you have newer players. I think they apply to request to be a part of the system, and then the board decides and opens up shares.
I see. Very interesting. Okay, so staying with you, now we were talking about the open banking part, but as you already anticipated, the other key innovation is the instant payments. So what's the experience of India in that regard, and in particular with regard to creating more inclusion and innovation through this instant payment mechanism?
Yeah. So UPI is, our main instant payment mechanism. And on the financial inclusion question, as I was saying clearly, there has been a really significant rise both in the value as well as the volume of transactions that we are seeing. One thing to just note there is that, although there is that phenomenal growth in terms of transactions, we do need to go a step deeper and think about who are these people doing these transactions and what are the nature of transactions happening. So mostly the data tells us that these are fairly low value transactions. So it's replacing low value day-to-day transactions, maybe at merchant outlets, exchange of cash between individuals, but it's not replacing the role of cash in the economy, which still remains, the dominant mode through which bigger transactions are taking place. So it's not replacing that. The other thing which I wanted to bring to the table is that, if you hear official narratives from India, usually the story will be as if this is a challenge which has been overcome completely, that, through architectures like this, we have solved the problem of financial inclusion, and that's not exactly the case, right? So I just wanted to show some stats again from the Findex, Global Findex report, which is from 2022. They say that the banking penetration has increased significantly, and that's not as a result just of the instant payments. There have been policy initiatives from the government where, through the use of our digital payment infrastructure and the digital identity infrastructure, there has been a move towards transferring welfare benefits to individuals directly to bank accounts. So opening of bank accounts and transferring funds into those bank accounts has been a really strong government policy, and that has created the base where payments can take place, because earlier people didn't even have bank accounts, and now they do have these bank accounts. So 77% as per 35% to 77% in 10 years is a really significant jump. So we do have a much more significant population which has bank accounts, but really when you think about who's dealing in card transactions, who's dealing in payment transactions, it is still concentrated in urban areas, still concentrated amongst younger male population in urban areas. So that demographic still dominates the market, but there is clear progress, since the recent past.
Okay, well, and the other big story that we hear a lot about instant payments is Brazil. Everybody's speaking about the impact of PIX. So has it been successful in creating financial inclusion, and what's been the impact more generally?
Yes, it has. But I actually want to connect that to the idea of DPI. So we spoke about open finance. Actually, the Agenda BC hashtag, the idea of the central bank was to create a DPI tripod, actually. So open finance as the base, because we need standardized data sharing for new products to develop, new business models. But PIX came with the idea, this is how we are going to make it massive. But how the central bank did it and conceptualized it was the idea that they coordinated the efforts to develop PIX from the technology to the adoption strategy, to the definition of norms. They created, yesterday Elena talked about that, but they created a strategy on how to make PIX massively adopted. So it wasn't like, okay, they gave the providers, private providers, minimum guidelines on UI and UX. So it became accessible. So they made partnerships with government, municipalities, and with some energy companies. So like, oh, if you pay your energy bill with PIX, the liquidation is instant, so we won't cut your energy if it's late. So this helped PIX becoming massive very fast and with a very diversified demographic. So in terms of financial inclusion, bringing some data, the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, they reported that Brazil reached last year its historical minimum in financial exclusion, so 16% of people financially excluded. It's not low, it could be lower, but it used to be more than 30. So it was a decrease, a very rapid decrease in 3 years, because PIX started in November 2020, so it's going to be, it's close to its birthday. But also, they had, like, in 6 months, PIX had 80 million users, and from varied socioeconomic and geographical profiles. Actually, more than 40 came from low income. So they also gave this data that in 6 months, 17 million people who had never made a transfer had used PIX. And they represented a large chunk of the transaction. By the end of 2022, Central Bank reported that 71 million people had been included directly through PIX. This was actually very helped by how they did their COVID relief. It was associated with PIX. And these results are considered a revolution, because they were like, okay, we have data sharing, we have this platform of payments which all providers with a relatively high number of users have to, it's mandatory, they have to participate, they have to build something upon it. So this actually resulted in success. I have only one point of contention, closely to what Schmidt talked about, is that what happens after people enter the system? Because they are being included. They only use cash, but how do they navigate the financial system? Do they have the financial capabilities and the financial education to access other products? This is something Brazil still has to grapple with, but it is a huge success, and it started from this DPI idea.
Yeah, so it connects well with what Larissa was saying at the beginning, the education part.
Yeah.
Is
Let me just address some comments related, because it faced on the governance strategy of the bank. Because since 20 years ago, the government just decided create or promote some efforts to promoting inclusive financial system in Brazil. Since then, the central bank made some efforts, such as like new regulatory for credit unions, free accounts of fees, establish the ombudsman as an obligation for each bank or institution, also establish some customer service channel. What the bank trying to do is create or build some relationship with some customers, but also increase the partnership with the ecosystem. So maybe 10 years ago, the central bank also created a forum for discussion of financial inclusion in Brazil. And this forum became part of the sandbox and laboratory that came for the last years. So those partnership is based on of the open finance governance system, the system that also provide for peaks, the relations that Bruna highlight here related to the energy companies, etc. But again, maybe the problem that you have seen in this is related to the citizen and the users, because you could not see which part they are included on it. Because they can have some discussion, some at the channels, but they don't understand well how this work, you know. So although I have some good comments related to our governance, because it's a good journey, you is still missing central usage related to the citizen users for inclusion on the system. That's it. Thank you.
We're
I
getting
forgot
there.
one thing. It's just that actually Brazil's central bank works with the concept of financial citizenship, not only financial inclusion. So they consider steps. So you have financial inclusion, then you have financial education, then you have consumer protection. It's not sequential, but it's this idea that using financial service is not enough. You have to know how to use it, why you're using it, and you have to make conscious decisions. So PIX has been considered a revolution in inclusion. PIX does not solve financial citizenship. So the idea is that the other parts of the agenda can build upon it, but it's important to make this statement. It helps financial inclusion. It does not solve financial citizenship.
Yes, and PIX is relatively easy to use. But now if we get to the next layer, the digital currency, that's quite challenging if you don't have financial education. So maybe let's start from India with regard to that. India in December 22 launched the digital rupee. How does this connect to UPI and digital public infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So this is a conversation, you know, the idea of having a central bank digital currency, which is being debated for a couple of years, at least since 2017. And as you said, in 2022, they decided to launch pilots. So a wholesale sector pilot and a retail sector pilot has been launched, where I believe in the retail sector, about 1 million people have currently been onboarded. A few banks have been onboarded. And the idea is to create special wallets. So these are not your general wallets where you hold the traditional cash, but a special category of wallet where, you know, this instrument called an e-rupee will be held. And you will be able to transact with other people, you know, who hold similar wallets. And one of the ideas, you know, around this is, of course, to reduce costs for the central bank, etc., and running of this and bring efficiency. But there's also this element of internationalization, which is, it's about, you know, cross-border flows and how that may be easier if you transact with this digital currency. And there is an MOU that has been signed between India and UAE, where they're trying to build a bilateral, they're going to pilot it for now to build a bilateral bridge between the two countries using the e-rupee. And similarly, on the UPI side, there has been a, you know, attempt to internationalize it over the last few years. So it's already begun with Singapore. So now UPI is already interoperable with the, you know, instant money payment system in Singapore, where you can do transactions from your UPI wallet and directly transfer foreign exchange to there. And you can see that these are clearly, you know, yesterday in the main session, we were talking about regulatory barriers being one of the blocks to international payments, and clearly here is a mechanism where the state itself is backing it, the central banks are entering into MOU, so that barrier really gets taken care of, and therefore the technical designs are being developed collectively by the two central banks and the agencies such as NPCI, and therefore, you know, it does overcome some of the barriers which we face in bottom-up kind of international payments.
No, amazing as an example of how digital public infrastructure can connect across states also, you know, and create externalities that go beyond the jurisdiction. So maybe this will be the case also with the Brazilian experience. As you were already mentioning yesterday, Bruna, there are some memorandum attempts to cooperate with Colombia and Uruguay.
Uruguay, yes.
Yes. But so tell us a little bit, you or Larissa, I don't know who wants to comment on the Digital Real project, so the DRX, as they call it.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the tripod of DPIs, Brazil built the open finance to make standardized data sharing possible, Pix to make digital payments massive, and the idea is that the digital real can make it programmable. So they made this decision that the digital real won't be focused on payments, actually. They are building the infrastructure on blockchain, and they want to use smart contracts to make automated payments possible. So people will still be using Pix, but they will be able to use Pix in an automated way. So they are not going to focus on payments because they believe payments as a method is already taken care of by Pix. So the idea is that they are going to use, just to give you an example, use smart contracts to make the release of the funds conditional and simultaneous to the change of ownership. So if you're buying a house, you use digital real, they only release the funds to the people who owns now when they change the
Title.
yeah, the contract is signed, everything. At the same time, the funds are liberated. So it's the idea, it's more of an infrastructure than like something like, than payments. Because, for example, China is more like focused CBDC on payments.
I would say it's more physical,
Yeah,
right?
it's physical is a bad word because it's digital.
I know, but
I
it's
think
not like the governance. It's more about, well, providing something that makes implementable something practically, rather than just providing the norms.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and this is what Schmidt said, it's also going to, there is this goal of making things cross-border possible. But the entire tripod, not just the digital real, the idea is that because we have this DPI, because the market is free to innovate and think about innovation without having to worry about the infrastructure, if it's a domestic success, we can make it international, either publicly with this a partnership with Colombia and Uruguay, but also enabling private providers to do so. So Interledger has the Patrick and Elena are grantees who are trying to make this PIX connection international. So it's this idea of DPI, it doesn't have everything, doesn't have to be all publicly provided. But with CBDC, the idea is that they're connecting multiple CBDCs platforms. So BIS, SWIFT has...
CBDC is Central
Bank digital currency.
Yes.
Yeah. So Larissa can comment more on the BRICS initiative, but the idea is to make it easier to provide cross-border payments using DREX, digital real.
Larissa, you want to come?
Yeah. Just one comment to relate the BRICS, because there is a plan. It's just a plan, a project to connect our digital currency between among those countries, you know, Brazil, China, Russia, etc. But they didn't put efforts to create it yet. There's just a discussion between the countries. But also the bank from the BRICS support another countries to build the digital public infrastructure with some investments. Okay, but another comment that I want to highlight related to the interoperability with PIX, the tripod that Bruna highlighted. PIX, DREX, and Open Finance is related a new not institution, but a new figure that you call initiators of payments. It's a kind of institution that is regulated by the central bank. That's the only part that the governance we work in the physical part of DPI, that we can connect the payments related PIX and the Open Finance. Just to give you an example to you, if you on e-commerce, you don't need to open your application from the bank, etc. You just get some QR code or token and can pay it. So all the integration comes for this kind of a new institution that central bank try and promote right now.
Yeah, it's a license that providers can get, and you may initiate payments without being a financial institution. So it's bringing actually providers from outside the financial sector into the ecosystem. So retailers are getting this license. Food and transport apps are getting this license. And they're starting to provide these payment solutions within their apps without having to be like a bank or be connected to a bank. So this is how they are doing all this tripod, is how this manifests, in new products, in new business models, in new entrants. So it's like the end goal. It's what they achieve.
Okay, we are getting closer to the end. So we have heard a lot of good things from digital public infrastructure. So I think it's good to enter into a more critical part. Like what, as you mentioned, is not perfect. We can always refine things. So how would we respond to the challenges that are still there with digital public infrastructure? For example, people criticize that this is creating a sort of, and Smithy mentioned it, a sort of local big tech, and also that you're forcing players to enter the system, and maybe this is against free enterprise. So there are some criticism. And so what do you see as the challenges that need to be solved going forward? And then I will open it up for also one question or two from the floor. You want to, anybody wants to mention their view on these challenges?
So I think one focus in the the DPI initiative in India has been this focus on scale, how to scale up really, really fast, similar to what tech companies would do, just move fast, break things. And in that process, there has been one from the part of the state, the use of coercion in some cases, right? So definitely in digital identity, but even in digital payments, really UPI took off in a big way, corresponding with a policy from the government where there was a demonetization of currency, where overnight 80% of the currency which was in circulation in the economy was declared invalid, and therefore people had no choice but to move to digital payments. So it wasn't something which happened organically, which just came about on its own. So there is those moments of coercion which you have to be worried about, at what cost are you trying to achieve scale. There is the consumer protection issue that we are seeing instances, and I think this is true of PIX also. We are seeing instances of fraud, a lot of social engineering happening. It may not be a breach of the system itself, but it's a breach of how people understand digital payments and how people are able to design cyber threats around that. And then not having correspondingly sufficiently, importance being given to redress mechanism, and therefore not being able to solve for those consumer issues. Of course, competition issues, as you mentioned, these questions about if you create a body like an NPCI, which is this one body which will do the standard setting, create this highly successful product like the UPI, then how can you have a competitor to it ever? This is really essentially a state-backed monopoly, kind of a natural monopoly being created in that circumstance. So who will be a competitor? Will you ever have a UPI 2, or will it be that all the innovation has to now be centered within this organization? And then lastly, just questions of accountability which come, as I mentioned, this is a not-for-profit entity, so it's not regarded as state. So whether you talk about, right to information that users and citizens would typically have against a state body or against a public authority, you will not have that kind of right to information or right to accountability for the market participants or for consumers. So there are those gaps in accountability which come with this particular structure that India has adopted.
Yeah, actually, I have 2 points. One is that it is valid that it may be creating a local big tech, as we've seen with India. I don't think this is the Brazilian case, so I think it's a real challenge, but it has solutions. So in this specific case, the Brazilian experience is that we created the DPI with, it was conceived from a logic of partnership with the private. It has problems, and Larissa will comment on them, but it is a logic of partnership with the private sector, with the explicit goal of offering the conditions for the development of new products and more competition. Because it started from a competition standpoint, I believe it did not suffer from this goal, because if you have to think about competition from the beginning, it corrects this problem. So I believe it's possible to build DPI without falling into a lack of freedom of enterprise or a local big tech. I believe Brazil is actually doing well with some governance issues. But I do have, we do have problems when it comes to looking more. We look a lot of this at the supply side, so guaranteeing infrastructure, guaranteeing interoperability. We do not look at the demand side enough. So when it comes to data sharing, Brazilians are actually scared to share their data. Okay, it's very good if you share your data through open finance and you get a better product. But Brazil is not being actually doing so well in guaranteeing that this data will be well taken care of. Brazil is not doing a good enough job guaranteeing that people who use PIX and enter the financial system, when they have access to products like credit, that they understand it and then they don't get over-indebted. Brazil is having an over-indebtedness crisis right now. So I believe we did very well when it came to the supply side of DPI. With all the criticism, I'll leave to Larissa because I agree with her. But on the demand side, I think it's lacking a little bit.
Yes, please, Alice.
Thank
We
you.
have like 3 minutes, so I don't think we're going to get into the last question.
I'll be fast. My main critical is related governance. The problem is in Brazil, actually, and not only in Brazil, but the most of the DPI that you're looking for, we never discussion relate the implementation or performance all those DPIs. We just agree that's a good model, etc., but you could not see how the synergy or connection between, for example, the users and another players works. Although I make some good comments related to the journey of in Brazil, or the governance journey, etc., you didn't see any part that the central bank include citizen to discussion, to explain step by step how it works. And I just give one example that happening right now with us. It probably will be happy in the governance of DPI for digital payments, etc. It's related to AI responsible or responsible AI. We also asking right now how you can include citizens to discussion it. In the local level, create some co-creation commitment or put citizen and the advisory board to explain a bit to make the transparency of the black box, etc. So my hypothesis is one time, citizen, you say, okay, I disagree with this DPI, we need to talk more, you need to explain to us how it works. So we need to learn more, understand more how you can evaluation or assess our performance as a DPI, but also sit and talk in the same level of the citizen. All our discussion is still at the technical level.
Can I summarize in one sentence? Brazil cared a lot about making the regulators talk with private providers. A lot, because competition was a goal. It didn't care enough about talking to its citizens. So now it has to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, it's not a real DPI. It's not real. DPI is about include citizen.
It's not good DPI.
Yes, good,
exactly.
sorry.
Yes. So, yeah, your answers were so elaborate that I think we closed it quite well. We don't have time for extra questions, but I think to summarize, we have, an issue of transparency. We have an issue of looking more to users and the demand side, not only the supply side. We have an issue of privacy also that is looming in the backyard. And we'll see. But the journey has been very informative, very inspiring for other countries. And hopefully this session will serve also to stimulate further discussion. We have now a break, so you can ask any questions to our speakers. And then there's another session on digital ecosystems here. So I invite you to that. Thank you very much. And we close.